I'm Jack Morrigan, 42 years old colonel in the United States Army, and after 21 years in uniform, I thought I had seen every kind of trouble a base could throw at me. I grew up in a small town outside Amarillo, where the wind never stopped, and the only thing louder than the storms was my father's voice telling me to finish what I started. That kind of upbringing settles into your bones, and by the time I raised my right hand at 18, I already understood the value of showing up, keeping quiet, and doing the job right. Most of my career has been in logistics, the part of the army most people never think about, but every soldier depends on. I learned early that battles fall apart long before the shooting starts, if the supply chain cracks even a little. By the time I landed at Fort Johnson, I had become the guy people called when trucks got delayed or the comms tower glitched or the ammo bay looked light and nobody could explain why. I never asked for recognition because the work itself always meant more to me than the applause. Life on a base teaches you its rhythms until they feel like your own heartbeat. You know, when the gate should open, when the convoy should roll, and when the fuel yard should smell different than it does. I had spent years watching those patterns steady and predictable, and I trusted them the way other men trust their instincts. That trust came from thousands of early mornings walking the motor pool, checking manifests, and doing the boring, honest work that keeps bigger things from falling apart. So when I sat at my desk that Monday and opened the weekly weapons transport report, I expected the same tidy numbers and familiar signatures that always filled the page. Instead, my eyes stopped on a name I had never seen written in ink that looked rushed, almost careless, right above an authorization line that should never change hands without a formal briefing. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but it felt wrong in a way I could not shake. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle while the unease curled in slow. After 2 decades of keeping this place running, I knew the difference between routine and trouble, and something in that signature told me trouble had already arrived. He stepped out of the black SUV like he owned the damn sun. Aviators, crisp uniform with barely a creased smile so polished it could have been printed. Major Colin Brooks. Hair slicked just right, hands in his pockets like the salute was optional, and a voice that sounded like it had been trained for TED Talks, not combat briefings. He introduced himself in the middle of the operations floor, called it a collab space, and started talking about synergy loops and operational reimagining. Not one mention of the chain of command, not one look at the posted duty roster. Just walked in like he was pitching a startup instead of joining a unit where every line on the board meant ammo, fuel, or food. I kept my mouth shut, watched the junior staff glance at each other like maybe they were the ones out of sync. Colin grinned like he'd just lit a fire under us all and said he wanted to unpack inefficiencies and shake the dust off legacy systems. I've heard that kind of talk before, usually right before something important gets broken. He skipped the systems tour, said he didn't need to see the motor pool or the manifest center, called it noise, asked instead if we had a digital transformation task force. I told him we had Sergeant Delaney, who tracks 42 moving parts with a clipboard and a head cold. He laughed, like I was joking. Later that day, I found him sitting in my chair legs. He waved me in, said we needed to think more like a platform than a post. That's when I realized he didn't just misunderstand how we worked. He thought none of it mattered. The discipline, the structure, the hard-earned order, all noise to him. I nodded like I was listening, but in my gut, I felt it. This wasn't just a bad fit. This was a threat. And threats in my world don't get ignored. They get logged, watched, and dealt with in time. It happened on a Tuesday over lunch, while most of us were still reviewing convoy routes and maintenance backlogs. Colin stood in the middle of the mess hall, smiled like he was announcing a raffle, and said Sergeant Miller would be transitioning out of his role to make space for adaptive modernization. No notice, no paperwork on file, just a casual sentence, wrapped in buzzwords delivered with a tray of chicken and rice in one hand. Miller had served 19 years, knew our logistics software inside out, and could trace inventory with his eyes closed and his back turned. He didn't say much, just nodded, shook a few hands and left with his dignity tucked under his arm. but I saw it in his shoulders, the way they dropped once he passed the double doors. Like someone had just pulled the frame out of the building and expected it to stand anyway. Colin dropped into the seat across from me like it was any other day. Said he hoped we'd all see the value in this culture shift. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any protest. He looked right at me and smiled like he'd just cleared a path. Like he thought I'd thank him for removing a piece of the old puzzle. That was the moment I knew this wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate. He wasn't fixing the machine. He was replacing it with mirrors and noise. I went back to my office, closed the door, and opened a blank folder on my drive. Named it simply Ops Notes. From that day forward, I logged everything. Every contract change, every skipped protocol, every time a seasoned voice got pushed aside for something flashier. I didn't know exactly where it was heading, but I knew momentum like this didn't stop on its own. And if it was going to crash, I intended to make sure there was a record when it did. By the third week, trucks started showing up late or not at all. Pallets meant for Fort Johnson were rerouted to a civilian depot in Tallahassee with no explanation. Training exercises stalled when the last box of dummy rounds ran dry and no resupply came through. In the armory staff, Sergeant Vega kept checking the manifest like it might correct itself. The radios on Range 3 went dark for 2 straight days, cutting off comms during a live fire drill. I watched a corporal rig a backup transmitter with duct tape and a 9-volt battery just to keep his unit from going blind out there. When I raised the issue in the morning ops brief, Colin leaned back in his chair like I'd interrupted a podcast. He waved it off, called it expected turbulence during a pivot phase. Then, like he was proud of the chaos, he announced we'd be bringing in vision partners to help streamline operations. They showed up the next week. Private contractors in tight blazers and leather shoes that crunched too loud on the gravel. One asked if our fuel requests were cloud syncs to an adaptive loop. Another wanted to gamify convoy tracking. Not one of them had worn a uniform or run a drill in their life. I stood in the motor pool and watched a 2 and lieutenant try to explain readiness scores to a consultant who thought platoons were interchangeable units like app features. Meanwhile, the back lot filled with half-maintained Humvees waiting on parts we couldn't trace through the new procurement system. Soldiers worked overtime without pay just to patch what they could by hand. Morale dipped hard. I saw it in the tired eyes, the short tempers, the way people flinched when radios clicked on, unsure if they'd actually transmit. A sergeant from logistics told me she was using her own credit card to cover a part shipment just to keep her team moving. Colin's only comment was that resistance was natural during disruption cycles. This wasn't disruption. It was decay. And decay spreads fast in places built on precision. I started pulling reports at night. Fuel usage logs, shipment, reroutes, maintenance backlogs. Something deeper was wrong, and it wasn't just a matter of missing boxes or bad timing. It was systemic, and if no one else was going to put the pieces together, I would. It started with a code in a line item, a vendor ID that didn't match any of our approved suppliers. At first, I thought it was just a clerical slip, maybe a typo buried in the noise of too many hands on the system. But the more I dug, the clearer it got. The ID linked to a company called Eastbridge Solutions, supposedly based in Delaware. No website, no contact person, just a PO box and a 6-figure contract for logistical analysis. I traced the payment trail and found 3 more names like it, all routing through similar banks, all with recent incorporation dates. Every one of them had one thing in common. A quiet paper trail leading back to 2 places, a lobbying group tied to Colin's father, and a campaign donor list from a senator who visited the base last year. The same senator Colin liked to name drop when things didn't go his way in meetings. I pulled archived procurement logs from 6 months prior and compared signatures on the approval lines. Colin's name started showing up before he was officially assigned to Fort Johnson. That made my gut clench. He'd been signing off on contracts he wasn't authorized to approve. And worse, nobody seemed to be verifying the access points. That's when I looped in Captain Jenna West. We'd worked together during a joint readiness audit 2 years back. Sharp calm under pressure, and the kind of officer who never looked the other way when something smelled off. She was now with Inspector Command and owed me a favor. I met her off base at a diner where the coffee came in thick mugs and the servers didn't ask questions. I handed her a flash drive and a manila folder with 3 contracts, 6 screenshots, and 1 annotated map. She read silently, her brow tightening with each page. Then she said one word: proceed. With Jenna on board, I knew we had teeth. The data was solid, the timeline airtight. Colin hadn't just bent rules. He'd stepped into a command seat with no legal backing and used that false authority to enrich allies and gut our operations. Now it wasn't just a matter of broken systems. It was fraud, and the proof sat in my hard drive like a loaded weapon. I printed everything the night before. 1 folder. No tabs, no highlights. Just clean evidence, lined up row by row, signature by signature. I didn't sleep, didn't need to. I'd already walked through it 100 times in my head. Every file double-checked. Every chain of custody locked down. I submitted it to Inspector Command at 500, then waited. The ceremony started at 900 in the officers' hall. Flags pressed seats, lined coffee, brewing in the back, like we were honoring a war hero. Colin showed up in full dress blues, aviators tucked in his chest pocket like a movie prop. He shook hands, flashed teeth soaked in every compliment like they were written for a magazine cover. A general from the Pentagon sent a pre-recorded message. Said Colin represented the next generation of military innovation. The room clapped. I didn't. I stood at the back folder under my arm, eyes on the stage. Colin didn't see me. Or maybe he did and thought I was just another face in the crowd. Either way, he didn't know what was coming. At 917, the rear doors opened. Jenna walked in, flanked by 2 JAG officers, plain suits, hard faces. She carried a sealed envelope marked top priority. The room quieted, like someone had cut the power. Colin blinked, still holding the mic, still smiling like the cameras hadn't stopped rolling. Jenna approached the podium. She didn't rush. She handed the envelope to the presiding colonel, then turned to Colin with steady eyes. The colonel opened the file, read the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened. Colin looked from face to face, still holding the mic, still frozen. The colonel spoke softly, but the weight of his voice filled every corner of the room. Effective immediately, the ceremony was suspended. Colin was to step down and follow the officers for a formal debrief. He stammered, asked what this was about. Jenna didn't answer. She just nodded toward me. I stepped forward, slowly, calmly, handed my folder to the colonel. That's when Colin's smile cracked. Not all at once. Just the edges twitching like a signal was breaking. He tried to speak, but nothing came. And I didn't say a word. I'd already said everything that mattered. In the evidence. In the silence. In the truth laid bare for everyone to see. The briefing room was sealed off by the time I got there. No press, no cameras, just brass legal officers and a thick silence hanging in the air. Colin sat near the head of the table, stripped of his rank insignia, sweat blooming under his collar. He looked smaller without the stage lights. One JAG officer opened a folder and began reading. Not accusations. Facts. Every contract signed by Colin after his arrival was unauthorized. Every procurement order, every dismissal, every strategic directive, all null. He was never formally appointed. The paperwork had been bypassed. There had been no board ratification, no command authorization, no lawful installation into the role. A captain from finance flinched when her name came up in a list of terminated employees. One by one, the room absorbed the impact. Colin had never held legal command, which meant no one under him was legally obligated to follow his orders. Every firing was reversible. Every budget cut contestable. Operations were tainted, chain of command fractured. Colin finally spoke. A low stammer trying to twist the meaning. Said he had verbal backing. Said he was promised the position. But no one looked at him anymore. Not even the junior officers who used to mirror his buzzwords. His voice shrank with each sentence. He started pointing, blaming miscommunication, blaming legacy systems, blaming me. The JAG officer raised a hand. The proceedings were not about opinion. They were about protocol. Colin's appointment had no legal basis. Therefore, everything that followed was invalid. His authority was a lie, and now so was his legacy. I watched the realization set in. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their chairs. Not just anger, but disbelief. That someone could wear the uniform, stand at the podium, issue orders, and never actually hold the right to do so. The weight of that truth cracked something in the room. It was over. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with clarity. Colin wasn't fired. He was erased, like a system reset. And all that remained was the silence after justice lands. They offered me his desk, a quiet room, a view of the flag, a title with weight behind it. I said no, not because I didn't care, but because I did. Too much to let my work become something it never needed to be. I went back to logistics. Same clipboard, same boots, same creaky chair in the corner office that still smelled like coffee and metal. That's where I belong. Among the ones who keep things running, who don't ask for medals, who fix what breaks without asking who broke it. Integrity isn't loud. It doesn't have a speech prepared. It shows up early, leaves late, and keeps promises no one else remembers were made. It's knowing where the extra bolts are stored and who's been missing overtime. It's holding the line not for praise, but because it matters. I remember being 19, standing in formation with a buzz cut and no idea what I was doing. A senior sergeant passed by, glanced at my uniform and said, "You're responsible for everything in your world, even the things no one sees." That stuck. For 21 years, that stuck. So I didn't take his job. I just made room for someone honest to step into it. Someone who earned it the right way. Through sweat, silence, and service. Not charm. Not shortcuts. Colin left the base in a black SUV before sunrise. No send-off. No salute. His name won't hang on the wall. His memos won't be quoted. In a few months, he'll be another file in an archive no one opens. But the soldiers he hurt, the systems he broke, the trust he shattered, those don't vanish. We repair them. Brick by brick, chart by chart. The way we always have. I'm still here. Same boots. Same flag. Same belief that doing the right thing doesn't need applause. Just action. Quiet and steady, like the hum of a convoy at dawn. That's what leadership looks like. And that's enough for me.